Uh, thank you for inviting me, and I'll be sharing a lot of wonderful artworks with you today. It's the subject is printmaking, but this is really the third chapter in a longer story. The first chapter being the development of paper, period. The development of paper is a long story, very interesting. And the second chapter is the development of printing, period, for communication, etc., which has a lot to do with writing and dissemination of information. So this is the third chapter of the story, which is also called Artist-Made Prints. Today I'll give you a very short intro to printmaking in the Western world, mostly Europe, of course. We'll try and define some terms. You got your glossary, but maybe I'll be able to explain some of those a little bit more. We will look at printmaking in the late 19th century, both in Europe, where it was already considered an expressive and creative mode of working, and then in the US, where in the 19th century it was useful. Posters, textiles, wallpaper, maps, packaging, books, newspapers, but certainly not very many artists. Then we will follow the story in 20th century America, and we will end up with a review of Northwest artists working today in contemporary, in our society, right next door to you probably, especially near Jinx anyway. Printmaking, ceramics, and photography had a crafts designation up until recently. They were sort of considered the stepchild of the arts, not very serious. Sculpture and painting were really where it was if you were an artist. But some of us liked printmaking, and perhaps you'll see why when we get started here. Okay, I guess we can get rid of the lights. Yes? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, it's easier to see these images without lights. All right. Just to clarify something on your glossary, woodcuts, which are also called, there's also wood engravings. The difference being that woodcuts are done on the plank and wood engravings are done on the end grain of the wood. It's one of the reasons why wood engravings are usually not very big, but sometimes blocks are fit together so that a print can be made that's larger. The ink is just rolled on the surface. Everything that is going to be white is cut away, and either it's run through a press or it's done by hand. A lot of relief printers like to actually use a baron, which comes from the East, or a spoon, or a big spoon. And you're probably familiar with potato prints and things like that. Those are all relief prints. On the right, then, you will see an intaglio plate. And in intaglio, what is gouged from the surface, what is taken away, is what will hold the ink. The surface is then wiped off, and it is usually put through a press with a lot of pressure. So if you have questions about these, we can talk about them later. Okay. Some of the very first Western prints were actually playing cards or done for the church in some way. This is one of the very earliest engravings. These are very small, and you'll see as we go through history how these prints keep growing. Very interesting. They get bigger and bigger and bigger. We don't know the names of some of these early printers, print makers, I should say. But you can see this is what, about 5 by 3 inches, and is a playing card. I'll give you names of a couple of artists who did early prints in Europe, and you could look them up later if you wanted to. Schongauer, very important person living in what at that time was going to be Germany, wasn't then, obviously. And this is also an engraving. These are usually done on metal plates. They were mainly done by artists who were trained as goldsmiths. You can see that happening. One of the more famous, Dürer. If anyone's been to Europe, you've seen a lot of his works, amazing artist. His father was a goldsmith, and Dürer worked in both woodcuts and engraving. This is a woodcut, and it's large for that period, 16 inches high by about a foot wide. 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and an engraving, which was done in 1514, of Melancholia. This is smaller, 9 by 7. But the interesting thing about even some of these earlier prints is that the artist could get away from the heavy political sometimes, or definitely religious themes that they had to portray in their paintings. So it was a way of doing something more philosophical, or something that was based more on everyday life. You'll see that happening more and more. Here's another woodcut. This is Baldung, Hans Baldung, and this is about the middle of the century, 16th century, called The Groom Bewitched. You see the witch over there on the right. So some of them had a good sense of humor. Here's someone you might know, Rembrandt, and this is the next century. This is 1639, and this is an etching. This is one of the first etchings. Etching is made by putting an acid-resistant ground on a plate, scratching through it, and then putting it into an acid bath. Of course, today we don't use acid, we use ferric chloride, but it's the same principle. And this is a self-portrait, obviously, an amazing, amazing artist. And then we'll jump to the next century. This is 1798, and this is Goya. The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, etching and aquatint. Aquatint is a form of a technique of putting a certain kind of texture onto a plate, but it's also put into an acid bath. Okay, this is sort of leaning up towards what's going to happen in the US. This was a very important period, mainly because almost all the artists in America at that time had to go to Europe for training. I'll start with the Philadelphia School of Design for Women. The other big school actually was not in New York. It was in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Academy of the Arts, which did not teach any nude drawing until I think about the 1870s, and women were not allowed to go to those classes anyway. It was a 2-year course, so anyone who wanted to go further in painting or in printmaking, which was becoming kind of popular, had to go to Europe. There was no other way. I'm going to show you what was happening in Europe at the time, because you can see why people wanted to go there. The sort of early Impressionists, this is Renoir, 1885, this is an etching. and it was becoming more expressive. You can see why, if you were an artist who was trained in the total narrow realist tradition, that these would be very exciting to see. So I'm going to take it from one artist's point of view who goes from the late 19th century through the early 20th century. This is Mary Cassatt. Cassatt was well known for her paintings, and she studied in Europe. Her whole family went over there, I think just as the Civil War was beginning. War has a lot to do with where artists work or don't work. And she spent 2 years at the Philadelphia Academy and then went to Paris to study. In Paris, she was not allowed to study at the Art Academy. It was only for men. But many of the teachers there also gave private lessons. And so she took private lessons. She traveled to Italy, to all the museums, and studied a lot of early painting. But the idea of printmaking actually came when she made friends with Degas, with Edgar Degas. And this is a dry point, about 1891. Very small, about 6 by 5 inches. And dry point, I should explain what that is. Instead of putting a ground on your plate, you just took your needle and just gouged into it. Just worked on getting your image strongly into that plate. She was amazing at it. This is the kind of art that was seen in Paris at the time. There was a very strong interest in Japanese art, and it was imported. This is a little woodcut, small woodcut. You can see even the themes are more everyday subjects. The theme of the mother and child is one that Cassatt worked on her whole life. And there's another one of her dry points. Okay, this is what an intaglio studio looks like today, but it looks exactly the same except for this fancy new press as it did in the 15th century. You can see the different parts that are necessary for intaglio work, mainly the press, obviously, and the old presses were fabulous too. A place to dampen your paper. The paper used for intaglio is always dampened, and a place to ink. The woman way over on the left there is inking her plate. In the earlier times, a hot plate was necessary for several different kinds of grounds that were used. Today we try to not use that because the fumes that are given off. Another print that was around in Paris at this time, and you can see the similarities with Cassatt's etchings. Her etchings are actually what she is really well known for, because she developed this entirely on her own. These color etchings are fabulous. I went to the Art Institute of Chicago and I was able to see the real ones, and you can't imagine how she did them. They are so well done, and I don't think anyone else has really worked very much that way since. It's very time consuming. But Mary Cassatt had her own press and actually printed these herself. Most of them take between 2 and 4 plates, each plate being a different color. At the same time, Toulouse-Lautrec was working. You can see that he was also very much influenced by the Japanese woodcuts. This, however, is a litho. So we're going to talk about lithography in a few minutes. The top 2 images are what a lithograph can look like, and the bottom 2 inches are what wood engraving looks like when you look at it very closely. Lithography, do I have pictures of this? Yeah. Lithography is done on either these very heavy limestones or on plates that are very finely grained and can take some of this greasy crayon that is the essence of the whole idea of lithography, which is that water and grease simply do not mix. So when you, first of all, grind down the stone, then you draw on the stone very carefully and make it more sensitive to accepting the ink, which is what the person is doing down here. And then that is rolled up and put through, there's a person rolling up actually a plate, which is on top of the stone, and then put through this press that is quite different from the press that was used for intaglio. It is not, there's no top roller to a lithopress. It just has a bar that you can press down on and move the bed through the press, and then remember to lift it up before you get to the end of the block, obviously. But these are very heavy, very difficult to come by, and actually not in use that much anymore. I mean, even for newspapers and books and things, these were used a lot. And of course, Toulouse-Lautrec was making posters, and that's what he used. So what was happening in the U.S. at this same time when Lautrec was making those gorgeous, gorgeous lithographs? Currier and Ives. Now, Currier and Ives had a fantastic business. They worked from about 1840, 50 through to about the 90s. Their logo was, let's see, Currier and Ives, cheap and popular prints. And they made, I can't remember, thousands and thousands of different prints. They were lithographs. Currier had a cousin who made the presses in the US, which was kind of interesting. But their themes, you know, you can see obviously what was happening. They were disasters, horses, sports, oddities, posters. Thought that was a good one. It was not what you'd call, you know, fine art printing. Lots of postcards, lots of political stuff, but most of them were sold as black and white images. And you'll see a lot of that, I think you saw that in the early prints I was showing, that if the artist or whoever made the print wanted to color it, they would have to paint in the colors. And that's exactly what happened with, we'll go back to a color one. Exactly what happened with these lithographs. Upstairs from where they printed, Currier and Ives had a whole host of women who sat at tables and each did one color. You know, yellow, red, blue. Sometimes using stencils as well. It was a big operation. Okay, so this takes us to what was happening from 1900 to 1930, because artists really did want to work in lithography. However, the process was very commercial, and in Europe, where a number of artists like Lautrec had really enjoyed working in that process, a lot of American artists, you know, only saw that like the Currier and Ives stuff, and they were not interested in embracing lithographs for what they might want to do. So there was kind of a push there to not work with lithography. Oops. And also in Europe, things were happening in terms of conceptions. Here is Edvard Munch. This was done in 1896, and you can see that sort of expressionism is starting to creep into the art world. He also did a wonderful painting. I think he did several different versions of the Scream. And here's the Picasso etching. Picasso was an amazing printmaker. He worked in every one of the techniques that I've mentioned, and also always seemed to be a little ahead of what was going on in the art world. So this is the Frugal Repast. It is an etching around 1900. So that's what was happening in Europe. What was happening in the US? We have Jean Marim, and this is his, again, etching of Chartres. At this time, almost any artist in the US worth their salt, whatever, was going to Europe, either to study or to make paintings and drawings and bring them back. Even though by the early 20th century, there were some studios and definitely some clubs, I'll call them, societies, that would teach someone how to do some of these things. But it was still a real difficulty for the artist to embrace commercial techniques and ideas. They really had a bad taste in their mouth about them. So when Marin went to and did this etching, this was in 1910, but look at this. By the time 1913 rolls around, and this is another etching with some dry point lines. This is the Woolworth Building in New York City. I mean, the change in his attitude is obvious. One of the other artists who went to Europe to learn printmaking was Edward Hopper. This is 1921 Evening Wind. This is an etching. Now, think of the size of these things. You know, they look incredible at this size, but these are like 8 by 9, 10 by 12, small, very small works. And here's another one by Hopper, Night Shadows, it's called, another etching. This is John Sloan, who was a very popular American, actually, turning out the lights in 5 by 7 inches etching, and one of Washington Square, shopping in Washington Square, another etching. And this is Peggy Bacon. A number of women were actually printmakers, and even in the late 19th century, there were exhibits in the United States of only women printmakers. So a number of women were actually involved in these techniques. So let's see, this is etching in dry point. It's called Art Class, and it's one of the larger etchings of the time, 16 by 9 inches. I wanted to show you what being a printmaker was about in terms of the market and the museums. Prints are made in editions. That means that the artist has to number and sign each one, and on each print there is what looks like 2 numbers that are a fraction, like it would be 10 over 25, 11 over 25. And these are the numbers of the edition. Once the edition has been filled, 25 over 25, this is what is done to the plate. It is canceled, and then an image is taken of that so that no more prints can be made from it. The The Europeans, of course, were very strict about all this stuff, and you will see as we get into America, things change quite a bit. But just to tell you what it was like, you know, in terms of being a serious art, actually. This was, I found this quite interesting because, you know, no one buys art very much, but these printmakers were trying to sell their prints, and here you could get all of these prints with your subscription to the New Republic for $9. I mean, sounds great. I don't know if it went over or not, but these are all American printmakers here, and I think I've shown you many of them already. This is Martin Lewis. This is another dry point, 1928. Just so you can get a feel for what was happening in the early 20th century in the US. And another one of his, Martin Lewis, called Shadow Dance. Those are all dry points, gouging right into the plate. And all of a sudden, we come across George Bellows actually working in lithography. The onus of lithography, because it had such commercial overtones, was something that some artists avoided and some artists embraced. In this case, George Bellows, and this is a print called Billy Sunday, embraced. And you'll see sometimes on these, on the pictures that I took, the artist will give a title, sometimes over on the left, and then in the center, there will be numbers or some kind of an indication of where this print was in the printing order. Dry points, for instance, have a very short shelf life. You can only print at the most 10 to 15 prints off of them. And then they either have to have some kind of like a steel or stainless steel thin layer put over them so that more can be made. But it does change the quality of the print. With lithos, it's the same thing. The blacks can fill in very quickly unless you have a printer who knows what he or she is doing. Anyway, and so then over on the right, the artist will sign it and put the date. This is Grant Wood. This is 1937. 1937 was a very kind of important year, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I assume that everyone has heard of Grant Wood. This is another lithograph. It's 8 by 11. And this is Lozowick, another really important American artist, Brooklyn Bridge, litho. So in World War I, the Americans were still going to Europe to study. They were making art and bringing it back, drawings and paintings of sort of special places in Europe. But Americans at this time, as you can see from this last group of prints, returned to focus on the regional subjects, things that they were familiar with for art. There was quite a big change then. All right, this is one of the things that happened. There was a Great Depression, and the WPA was formed 1936, and it went actually through until Pearl Harbor was bombed, and then the money had to go for something else. There were about a little over 3,000 artists who were hired to do projects that had a lot to do with capturing the sense of what America was at that time. This included photographers, printmakers, painters, people who went around recording music of America, a lot of different kinds of artists. Of course, the artists who were not chosen had a big protest, but you know, that's what life is about, I guess. So one of the people who did do work for the WPA was Grant Wood, and that piece that I showed you earlier was part of this. Can't remember how many pieces of art were done, a huge number of works. I wanted to show you this too because maybe you know the name Gordon Gilkey. Gordon Gilkey was an amazing man. I just loved him. When the World's Fair was coming to New York, he volunteered to make prints of everything that was going on then. And this is one of his etchings with aqua tint that he did at that time. After that, he went in the service, and it turns out that he was one of the monument men after the war who found a lot of the art pieces that had been hidden away by the Nazis. He came back to the Northwest and taught. He taught in Corvallis, and he taught in Portland. He also collected prints, Northwest mostly. When he retired, he formed the Gilkey collection, excuse me, of graphic arts at the museum, at the Portland Art Museum. It was unbelievable because prints, you know, if they're museum quality, have to be kept at a certain temperature, they have to be kept flat and all that. Not in my studio, but, you know, there. And he did all that. Plus, he invited classes and artists to come and go through these prints and really learn from them. And really quite an amazing man. So I'm going to show you, this is another print of his that he did in 1993. So you can see that he also moved on. This is an aqua tint, and it's a little bit bigger, 12 by 17. Very, very lovely piece. In 1937, something else happened. This is Guernica by Picasso. It is not a print. It is a painting. But Guernica was a small town in Spain that was bombed by the Italian and German forces as sort of a lesson. There were no military forces there, but it was just civilians who were killed. And Picasso became very, very upset about that and did this painting, which if you see it is quite horrific. It's huge. It's 25 feet or more long, so that if you're standing in front of it, you are a little person. And this is it in situ, and there's also kind of a nice comment there that supposedly Picasso made when he was asked if he had done this painting. He says, "No, it is you who did it." He was talking to a Nazi soldier. This really started a big exodus of artists from Europe. Let's see, we can have that next. Okay. The artists who came over, some stayed and became citizens, and some stayed only to teach or start some kind of a studio at the time, and then return to Europe. But things were changing very quickly here. As you can see, here was the WPA with their very regional focus, and all of a sudden, here come these uppity Europeans over here to teach us about printmaking. This is Stanley Hayter. He is British, was British, and this is from around 1940s. It is an engraving with some soft ground. The one on the right is actually a detail of the one on the left, and you can see some of the textures that you can get in etching that are really rich. Hayter came over here. He had such an amazing enthusiasm for printmaking. He started what was called Atelier 17 in New York City. Just about every artist you'd ever heard of studied there. He stayed, here's another one by Hayter. It's called Combat. He stayed here only about, I think it was like 10 years, since he decided, after the war, that it was fine to go back. So he went back in around 50. Here's another one of Hayter's. And this is interesting because he was really into intaglio mainly, but this is intaglio and silkscreen. The color is put on with silkscreen rather than hand painted on. So all of a sudden we've got another technique to use. Silkscreen was again turned down by most Americans as being a very commercial kind of technique because it was used for printing fabrics. It was used for printing billboards. And if you've ever seen a billboard being printed, I've seen one. It was unbelievable because the pieces of paper are huge. And I'll show you something about that in a little bit. Anyway, so this was Hayter, who stayed in the country for about 10 years and really was an energizing force. This was Maurizio Lasansky. Lasansky was my teacher, and his family had fled from Europe earlier on, probably the First World War, because they were Jewish, and landed in Buenos Aires. So he came up to the States in around 1940, 44. He studied at Hayter's, as you can see, at Hayter's Atelier 17. This is an engraving, which is, again, done by gouging out the metal. It was a very time-consuming technique. And see, here's another one of Lasansky's, and this one is an etching with some engraving. Most of the artists who came at that time, this is Gabor Peterdy, and then I have another one of de Kooning. What happened was that the excitement about printmaking at this time caused just about every university in the country to want one of these artists to work for them. And so these artists came and established studios, established degrees in many, many, many universities and art schools. Lasansky was at the University of Iowa. Peterdy was at Yale. I mean, these people stayed for years. They were there 50 or more years. So they were a very turning force in the idea of printmaking in the States. This is de Kooning, and here he is using lithography to do his work. This is a little bit larger. Here we're starting to get pieces that are a little bit larger. This is 27 by 21. And actually, that one of Lasansky's, I don't know if I want to go back to it, but it was 44 inches long. So this is the first time we see these very large prints starting to happen. At this time, we have to remember that other artists, painters mostly, were also doing and experimenting with a lot of different forms. Jackson Pollock, for instance, had his first show in 1941. Maybe you've heard of Morris Graves and Mark Tobey. They were really strong Northwest artists who already at this time had a reputation. The artists from Europe came to us from the Bauhaus, for instance, and many of the surrealists also came here and made this their home. Am I turning the right thing here? Okay. So we go to the 50s, and I call this the second generation because these people studied with those first printmakers who came here. This is Mishkon, wood engraving, and again, going back to the idea of engraving. These are Americans now. Here's Leonard Baskin. This is a wood cut called Man of Peace, and this is 60 inches long. So this is one of the very first really, really big prints. Now you have to remember, to have prints this big, you have to have paper this big. So that was another problem. Earlier on, most of the paper came from Europe as well, and it wasn't until the late 19th century that paper mills really started going in this country. Okay, this is Dean Meeker, who was at the University of Wisconsin for, who knows, another 50 years. Sister Mary Carita, and these last two were screen prints. That's what they're called, screen prints. There was a fancy name that they tried to use for them, which was serigraph, but screen prints is what has stuck. This is an interesting woman who literally got lithography going as an artist medium in this country. Her name is June Wayne. This is a lithograph called The Tower of Babel. In around 1950, there were very few, if any, I don't know, printers who could print fine art lithography. So her goal was to train printers in lithography. She got a huge grant from the Ford Foundation to start some kind of a workshop to train these people. It was called Tamarind, and it was down in Los Angeles, and the idea formulated with the Ford Foundation was that this studio, workshop, whatever you called it, would last 10 years, and at the end of that 10-year period, it would go to the University of New Mexico, where it is still today. This workshop printed many of the major printer artists of the last century, and of this century too, but mostly lithography. It was called Tamarind. Okay, now we come to the 60s, and weird things are starting to happen in the 60s. Everywhere. Remember this? Okay, here we go. This is 62, Andy Warhol, called Dollar Bills. This is a silkscreen on canvas, huge silkscreen on canvas. And there's his Marilyn, again, huge. It's 82 inches high and 114 inches across. It is all silkscreen. You know, obviously these artists were responding to the commercialism of our society and this repetition of images that we see everywhere all the time. I think one of the nicer things about seeing these in real life is not just the scale of them, but the way that it was printed is, you know, very, I don't know, it becomes very emotional to see the way that Marilyn's face just kind of fades out. Anyway, there's a quality about silkscreen that is, in the way that he used it, is very moving. This is what a silkscreen studio looks like. They say, oh, you can do it on your kitchen table, and of course you could, but it's very messy. As you can see, here's a person, there are two screens going at the same time. The wooden-handled rubber spatula thing, squeegee, thank you, is what pushes the ink through the open parts of the screen. So, silkscreen has to be done. One color has to be done all at once, and then the second color, and then the third color. Okay, this is a one-arm squeegee, which I wish I had, but I've got a husband, so I don't need it. The ones that have been formulated for like billboards are huge, can imagine. And of course now there are motorized ones that can do that work too. But it's still pretty amazing to me. So another artist who was really caught on prints was Jasper Johns. This is an early 70s work. And this was, I think this was printed at ULAI. I should tell you a little bit about that. United Limited Arts was, again, another workshop that was begun on the East Coast by another woman, Tatiana Grossman. Tatiana Grossman had to flee, actually, from Russia. And she spent time in the weirdest places, I don't know, before she got here. It's amazing that she did get here. But once she got here, she and her husband set up a print shop that printed reproductions, like for museums. You go to a museum and you get this little, you can buy any painting in any size. And that's what she was doing. However, someone said to her, well, listen, I think it was someone from the museum said, you're really good at this. Why don't you print artists? So she did. She started printing artists, and from 60 to about, I think she died in the 80s, but the workshop is still going today. And this is in this lovely little white country home on Long Island, where it still exists and has expanded to do more than just litho or etching. It uses the whole range of techniques. So anyway, okay, I think this is another one of John's. This is called 0 to 9. So it's a very different attitude that is beginning here. Again, a very large print, a picture of Johns and Warhol. I put this in because then you can see Elizabeth Taylor in the background there. Big. These were big. All of a sudden, art was big. Maybe it was because of the availability, or people had bigger walls in their house, or the museums liked big. I mean, Jackson Pollock's pieces can be huge. I'm going to go back to that. So actually, this was done at another workshop in LA called Gemini GEL. And here we're expanding the idea of what is printmaking. This was actually imprinted on a thin lead plate. It's called High School Days. That's a little mirror that's implanted in the shoe, there. These guys were fun. And this is one of the largest prints ever. This is 72 inches high. It's litho and silkscreen, and this is Robert Rauschenberg, 1967, called Booster. This is a self-portrait. And he went on to do all kinds of amazing collages, usually using photo printmaking of some kind, photo silkscreen, photo litho, collage, everything mixed together. A very, very important artist. His son runs a gallery and workshop on photography up in Portland. There's another one with a good sense of humor. This is Ed Ruscha. This is a silkscreen. Now, Ed Ruscha, again from LA, printed a lot of his prints with jam. What else did he use? Caviar. Oh my God, what a waste. And people bought them. I mean, obviously fugitive colors, but really an interesting artist. And we come to Roy Lichtenstein, or Lichtenstein, however you want to say it. This is late 1960s, called Cathedral Number 4, and this is a lithograph about 50 inches high. So all of these artists at the beginning of the century were going to Europe to do their cathedrals. And here is Lichtenstein sort of looking at it from a different angle. When something is printed commercially, it is broken down into the 3 process colors plus black. And those are put through screens so that it's all done in dots. So where there's more red dots, it's redder, and where there are more blue dots, it's bluer, etc. So Lichtenstein was very interested in that process. He wanted to make art that looked like it had never been touched with a human hand. However, this is a litho, but this is a woodcut. I mean, huge. He loves making woodcuts, and they are sometimes, 5 by 6 feet or more. And for every color, you have to, cut a different woodcut. I wanted to show you this because these are some of the references that Lichtenstein uses. You can see he's very much interested in old comic books, of course, but other images. He just collects these things and then puts together his imagery from there. So that's what the 60s. The 60s were incredibly invigorating, wonderful atmosphere. You could try anything. It was great. And after the 60s, artists went on their own path of experimentation. There were many different paths. Can I continue, or can I go for a while? Is it okay?
Good time for a break.
Is it? Want to start before we get to the 70s? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. From the 70s on, I'll just show you a whole bunch of slides of people I know. Because we are actually a very tight group, especially here in the Northwest. Most of us belong to PAN, Print Arts Northwest, which if you ever have a chance to join something like that, you do get prints at a discount, and they are all from the Northwest. Okay, 1970s. I'm going to show you, I talked about the different paths that a lot of artists took. First one is Sid Shavitz, an amazing man, spent his whole life in Columbus, Ohio, teaching, and this is an etching he did called Communication. This is in 63. Well, I left the titles on this so you could read them and feel you didn't need to listen to me. Another one of his, this is a woodcut called The Three Graces. We all know that one, don't we? And here's another one of his. I had forgotten all about this, actually, until I came across it in his catalog. This is called Ephemera for the Archives, and it's a photo etching and chencolé. Chencolé, when you see that written down, means that during the printing process, a different color or kind of paper is put through the press at the same time as the plate and attaches itself to the paper underneath the ink. So you can see here that he's got this piece of gold up there. You see where the colored pieces are. Those are chencolé. And if we go back about 100 years, this is around 1830-something, I guess, we get to Daumier. Now, Daumier did many prints. This was a litho. This is called The Legislature. Have things changed? Daumier was sort of the breadwinner for the family and was a law clerk for quite a while. until he finally started selling some of his cartoons to newspapers, etc. This was done by, first of all, making little clay people and then drawing those little clay figurines. I mean, everybody has their own process. I showed you what Lichtenstein's process was. This is Daumier's process. Okay. Now here's a very famous Northwest artist, Jacob Lawrence. Wonderful, wonderful man. A silkscreen, voting rights, this was called. And some of these are pretty large prints. I left all that on there so you could read it, but the print itself is 32 long by 24 wide. There's another one, the Olympics. Jesse Owens was very high in his mind. And here's another one, library. He grew up in New York City, and the library was his both resting place and Mecca. Okay, now we get to this. I'm just going to kind of go through these and maybe tell you what medium they were. If you have questions, raise your hand real quick and I can answer them about any of them. But I've tried to pick out relief prints, and then I've picked out some lithos, and then some silk screens, and then some other. Okay? So these are the relief prints, and you may recognize some of these names because a lot of these people lived around here. These are all Northwest artists. Manuel Esguerto. This is a woodcut called Grand Rodeo. Amazing. This is Louisa Chase, and again, woodcut, huge, 33 by 39. Paper, if you get it in sheets, usually the largest is about 44. And Thicket, another one of hers. And remember that each color needs a different plate, a different woodcut, I should say. This is an amazing one, Joseph Raphael, California. And this is, it's the wrong one, a second. Pat Seiler, right, who actually taught with me at WSU. And he would just use like a mat knife to cut these things. Every time I saw that, I go, I would just be in blood. And then he would print them all like with the back of a spoon. And they're good size too, actually, 24 by 30, this one. Very, very funny guy. And this is Joseph Raphael. This is, I can't remember how many different blocks this took, but several to get all those colors in there. So it is amazing what people can do with what we think of as a very simple medium. Deborah Mirsky is such a character. These are done on clay relief. She actually does the clay and then sort of, I think, paints water-based paint on them and then prints. It's good size. Jack McClarty, Wall City. This is a lino cut, which is a lot easier to cut, actually, but it's a lot easier to make mistakes, too. This was obviously done with several different plates, as you can see. Now, this is Peggy Prentice, who was sort of the force behind the printmaking department at the University of Oregon in Eugene for years and years. She just recently retired. This is mostly woodcut on handmade paper, but she also uses colored paper pulp in her works. She and her sister actually had a paper company in Wisconsin, and I think you can still buy watercolor paper from that company. Twin Rocker, it was called. Her sister was a twin. This is someone you should recognize. This is Ann Kresge. A relief on handmade paper, and again, she does whatever she will with those pieces of paper. This is 60 inches long by about 30 wide, and here's another one of hers. Looks like a big lollipop to me. Another woodcut done by John Buck. This is about 6 feet high. Yep, no, 5 feet. This one's the 5-foot one. Amazing, amazing work. And another one. These are really fun to look at in real life because they're just about that big. So, wouldn't want to frame them myself, but it's okay. And this is his printer, which happens to be in Lyons, Colorado, where Jim and I spent many years, showing how they work, which is inking by hand and then pulling the print here. Again, you have to have paper, quite big. Okay, here's some intaglio. You will again recognize some of these people, I hope. Yuji, who had a show at the Bush Barn recently. He works with a lot of different chancolet, etc. There's the word, chancolet, with the different papers that are attached. This is Joe Feddersen. He is a Colville Indian. He taught at the Evergreen State College for maybe 30 years and just, again, recently retired. Haley Ford has a number of his pieces, and they're all fabulous. This was inspired by Indian blankets. You can see that if you really start looking at it. Amazing artist. This is Pat Steer in Seattle, and she really likes to scrabble on her plates. It is actually an etching with some dry point, and because of all the different colors in there, it is a bear to print these things. I have a friend who has printed for her, who is a master printer, and that's what he says too. I hold my tongue, he says, George Johansson, a Portland artist who does amazing prints. He has a large painting over at the Haley Ford that is all red with a black cat running through it, maybe, or jumping through it. Maybe you've seen that. He also does all his own printing. He's in his 80s. I saw a big show of his last year. And he does what is called reduction woodcuts. A reduction means that you start off just taking away what you want white. You print that. You have to print all of them. You know, if you're going to do 20, 25, you have to print 30, 35 because some aren't going to work out. Then you take away more from the plate, from the woodcut, so that that color that you had printed first will show through. It goes on and on and on. And he does this all himself. As I said, he's in his 80s. And his additions are all like 25. And I could not believe it, but I saw him standing there. George, do you do this? Oh, yeah, I do this all myself. Amazing man. Barbara Noah. And this is, these are 1, 2, 3 different plates, all photo etchings on copper. Liza Jones is one of the people in Portland who has started a studio where people can come and work with her, or she will teach people as well. Mostly etching. This is aqua tint and dry point. This is Eric Chesbrough, and some of these images were done on a computer, but then were put into a photo etching mode. Seattle artists. This piece is etching in dry point again, but think again of all the different colors and how, because there are 4 plates here, they all have to match up. Not easy. So the whole thing is by 34 by 34. Quite beautiful. You should recognize this again. There was a show at Haley Ford of Sherry Wolf's, mostly paintings, but she's done a lot of prints too. This is etching, but it is hand colored. And this is something that I haven't talked about as yet because I can't believe people really do these. This is called a mezzotint. And it's 12 by 18 inches, which is about as big a mezzotint as anybody would ever want to do. It's a process where the entire plate is rocked with a tool that leaves little holes everywhere, and until it's totally black. And then the artist comes in with a burnisher and burnishes from the grays to the whites. And I think you have to be crazy. But it's amazing. It's amazing. 3 graces, some screen prints, lovely person who lives up again in Seattle, this person, Sandra Feckleton, open work this is called. But I wanted to show you, the next one is not silkscreen, the difference between her work in silkscreen and her work in offset litho. Offset litho can be very, very accurate. And you can see how tight that is in comparison with that first print. And then here's another artist who was chair actually at Portland State University for many, many years, Rita Robillard. A very beautiful array of screen prints. I can't believe, again, that somebody does this with screen printing, but she does. It's good. Lithographs. Ray Mahaffey from Portland, who has, again, a wonderful studio up there. Roy Nebeker. There was a show recently at the Haley Ford of Roy Nebeker's work. He had a great sense of humor, and lithograph was, I think, just right for him because he could really play with some of those wonderful effects from the touche. The touche is the liquid grease that is put onto the stone. This is Joan Snyder, and done in 1985. And it's a large print, 44 on a piece of paper, 44 wide, and it's called "Can We Turn Rage into Poetry?" I see a lot of rage, I don't know. And this is Susan Shatter, Rock Face. The idea of landscape, of course, has always been uppermost with a lot of printmakers as well. Okay, now I'm going to go to what I call other prints. This is what I guess Berger calls this an iris print, but it has been generated in a computer and it is printed at a certain size. So, you know, you have to decide for yourself, I guess, how you want to think about these. Quite beautiful print, though. And I just had to show one of my husband's works. This is called Angel Angle, and it is 3 by 4 feet, I believe. And that has definitely been computer generated and then printed out. This is Keiko Hara. Keiko Hara was sort of the guiding light at Whitman College for maybe 30 years, and did these wonderful monoprints that she would put into installations of different kinds. Actually beautiful to walk through. And this is the person who has taken her place, Nicole Pietrantoni. She calls these books. And this first accordion book is called Sunset Strips. And it's only 3 feet long, but it's about 4.5 feet wide. So it's a smaller piece than the rest of hers. This one is called Precipitous. These are 5 books, and each one is about maybe 6 feet. So artists are using their prints as installation. And here's one called Implications, 33 feet long by 9 feet high. Quite beautiful. Okay, this is my ad. I do workshops on different kinds of printmaking. I have one coming up at the art department in April, and you don't have to have any experience at all. We start from the beginning, and it's a lot of fun, and it's 2 days, and you will learn so much in 2 days you won't believe it. I hope it doesn't make your head hurt, but anyway. So I'm going to just go through a couple of my prints. I think I put about 5 or 6 in here so that you can see some of the things I'm interested in. Most of the printing I do lately has been on my paintings or painting on my prints. I think I only brought 1 of those. So these are some old etchings that were on copper plates. They're about, 2 by 20 inches, maybe, called Bus Depot. This is a screen print, and this is called The Foolish Conceit of Human Control. This is a lithograph called Old Friends. Oh, this is a small print with metal. This is aluminum pieces attached, called 3 Ways. Love in the Afternoon. And a lot of that is with photo stencil work too. Screen print with metal. Another one with hands called The Gold of the Wise is Heavier Than Lead. And sometimes you'll see AP in the middle of a print, and that means that's the artist proof. Normally, when you do prints, the artist takes a number for him or herself, and it could be just 3 or 4, could be up to 15, depending on how large the edition is. Silkscreen editions are usually a little larger than many, so you can get a number of artist proofs that way. There are also, sometimes you'll see written down there the word state. State 1, state 2, state 3, or just state. And what that means is that it is not the completed image. And here's a 25-foot long piece I did. This is when we were actually dedicating it. This is up in Vancouver, Washington. And the whole central area of that piece is relief printed. The top and bottom are painted. It's called Faux Phoenix Sightings. And you can go see it almost any time. It's in the auditorium, so sometimes there's a class in there, but that's where it is. Okay, I think that's it. Questions? Okay. No question? Oh, question, yes. Oh, thank you. He's going to run around with the...
This is Charlene. I'm curious, do artists who do this kind of work make a picture first so they know which colors are going to go next? It seems to me amazing that you can visualize what you're going to do and then have to do it in stages.
That's a very good question because every artist does it differently. And that's why when you're doing a print, you sometimes have to, on the first color, just make lots of them because you don't know how it's going to, the next color is going to affect it. In fact, you may be ready on a screen print, for instance, to get that second color on, and you know what it's going to be, and you think you know what it's going to look like, and it's too opaque, or it's too transparent, and you can really control these things. And you know, after a while, you get to get a feel for it. But yeah, you're right.
Hi, this is Roz. Could you expand on what you mentioned about an artist proof? The whole run is the artist, isn't it? I mean, when you say they take some for themselves, because we have an artist proof and it's numbered, and I never knew what it was. I thought maybe it was printed slightly different, like a dry run, you know. So could you just expand on that?
Usually, there's nothing usual these days, but usually that is a finished print, and the artist has sort of kept it out of the edition. The edition then is either, you know, up for sale or put in a drawer. Lots of those. So that it is a little separate from the edition, but it's usually a finished print. So it's good. It's good. It's one that was selected by the artist. Why not?
Joe Jenks over here. Discounting prints that are made of fine art so that people could have copies in their homes. There is a distinction about printing that is somehow feels very different from painting, oil, acrylic, watercolor. What is it about printing that drew you to that as opposed to something out of a tube?
Oh, good question, too. I like drawing. I am not great with color. So black and white, which is what most of the prints that were made at that time were, just black ink on paper, drew me to want to draw something that could have different boundaries than just a drawing. I mean, the textural qualities of metal are amazing. And then being able to experiment with color with screen printing was such fun. You know, for me, who is, color not great. So that helped a lot. Does that answer your questions?
Hi, Joe. This is Bob. And my question goes back to something you said about, and you were comparing lithographs with screen printing. And my general question is, what aesthetic implications or options would lead you to pick one form of printmaking over another, given all the different techniques you described?
What's available? Yeah, I know and it is fun to try different techniques. You have to have a love of paper. Some artists actually print and then make three-dimensional objects out of their prints. Some people tear them and form them into another kind of object. But you have to have usually a love of paper or whatever the matrix is going to be. That's a very amazing. I guess everybody would answer that differently.
Hi, this is Ken, right over here. I was just curious, for years I was an engineer and used blueprints, and I had no idea how they were made. Can you just briefly describe that?
Blueprint is not really this kind of a printing at all.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a diazon, dioxide, whatever it is. It's an entirely different way of working.
This is Wayne, down over here. I have a question from early on in your lecture. You mentioned that the early printmakers had some freedom from religious symbols used in their work. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Say that again, please.
About the early printmakers having freedom from using religious symbols.
Not religious symbols, but subjects.
Subjects.
When most artists had been commissioned to do different works,
Okay.
and the commissioned works were almost only religious, so that when they got into their little studios and started scratching on plates or gouging out wood or whatever, they started working with different ideas, and people liked that, so kept going. Does that make sense?
Hi, this is Anne. I'm a little familiar with etching and engraving, but it sounds like dry point is an etching technique that has similarities to engraving. Is that correct? Or could you expound on those a
Yeah.
little?
Dry point is a way of working directly on a plate, and a needle, a very sharp needle, is used to kind of gouge into the plate in a very different way from the engraving tool, which is a burin, B-U-R-I-N, and the burin removes the copper or whatever you're using so that you have a nice clean gouge in the copper, whereas the dry point needle throws up that part of the metal, and so you get a fuzzy line. So you can look at a print and say, use dry point here. And some people just use dry point on some of their work. Does that make sense? Okay. And it's a different quality from an etched line as well.
Hi, this is Cassia. I can understand how lithography might not be a method of choice, considering you're probably moving around pretty heavy blocks of limestone. But I'm wondering, are those blocks of limestone reusable? Can they be resurfaced and used again?
For hundreds of years.
Okay, all right, well, that helps. So you have this stack of limestone blocks outside your shop. And also, what about the wood ones, the wood carving ones? Can they be resurfaced again and reused? And where do
These are
these
good.
wood things come from?
Okay. In terms of your first question, there are now aluminum plates that have been made so that you can do the same kinds of marks on them as you could with stones. It's not quite the same, but it's not as heavy as you can imagine. It's printed the same way. The press does not have a roller on it. It has a blade, and the blade comes down very hard, and the metal or stone is run through that, and that's what picks up the ink from the plate or the stone. Now, what was your second question? I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. You'd be surprised how hard you have to look for a good big block of wood. The end grain, which is wood engraving, sometimes the engraving, they are put together, several pieces of wood, and then sanded down. So the wood engraving blocks never get really huge. People use every kind of wood they can find. And that's why also lino cuts came into being, because then you don't have to worry about the wood if it's got its own texture, its own grain, don't have to worry about it. You can just work on linoleum. Pardon me? It would be hard because you gouge out quite a bit on a wood block.
Hi, Joe, this is Jim. When you mentioned those artists that took their prints and made them into other things, it reminded me, back in the 70s, I worked with mainly Tauromachie time for Picasso's prints. And he could not leave his prints alone. He always messed with them. He would take his thumb and work it, and use colors. And so no two prints, even though they were in the same series, would be alike. And in a way, that's kind of clever. They weren't very expensive at the time. I mean, this is Picasso, and in the 70s, a fair-sized print would go for $7,500, which is cheap for Picasso, basically. And I was wondering, are there record sales for certain types of prints, like Munch or someone like that, going back in time, who's a very well-known artist? Or
That would be something I would enjoy researching, actually. And the idea of every print being slightly different in an edition is not a new one at all. Series, sometimes they're called a series of prints, and they have to be numbered differently. That's the other thing. There was a very strict way of numbering your prints, and that is not quite as important today. It was important for museums, for dealers, obviously, and a lot of people feel like, I got number 3 out of 300. Wow, it doesn't matter because they're all the same, right? They are all originals. What was I going to say about that? A series. That's another way of dealing with it. If you could change a little bit on each print, it was called a series. So that would be put in that middle slot, where there's the artist, the title, how the print is designated. It would just say series A or series blue 1/3 or none, or just 1. That would be it. But it should be designated. And it used to be very, very strict, all of these rules about this. And it's not quite so strict since pop art. Let's face it.
Sharon here. Elton Bennett was another one that fiddled with every print, so I don't think he ever did series. Well, I'd have to look at some of the things to see. But could you speak at all about Crow Shadow and its influence today?
Crow Shadow is fabulous. I had a student who was hired there as one of the master printers. Crow Shadow was founded by James Lavador and one other Indian, I can't remember who it was. It resides in Oregon, but way over on the other side of Pendleton. I can't remember if it's, and it is on the Umatilla Reservation. And actually, we white folks can go there and print too, which is nice. But it's been fabulous for really teaching a lot of young artists, especially Indian artists, about printmaking. And Haley Ford is very lucky to have a number of those prints. So if you ever wanted to see them, I think you can make an appointment to get over to Haley Ford and check that out, because they are amazing prints. In fact, there are some that are in the collection almost all the time on the second floor there. Wonderful. And as you look at them, you'll see that these are all very well-known artists, John Quick to See Smith, and I mean, it's just wonderful. Yeah.
I thank you for mentioning Not only James Labrador, but now I've forgotten what I was going to say. I'm doing this more and more. He had a major showing at Halley Ford right soon after they opened, and you mentioned him at the beginning of your talk. Sharon, who is that?
Oh,
Jacob Martz, yes, excuse me.
Fabulous.
His migration series was there, and other major prints. And one of his prints of the New York Public Library migrates around the Willamette Library. So folks might want to take a chance to see that at some point.
Thank you for mentioning that. I saw that Sister Mary Carita also has a print in that collection up there. So that definitely, you should go up and take a look at those. And they're all different media, all different techniques. Pretty neat.
My name is David. So how much do they know about the early history of doing this? When did it start? Who started it? And so on.
All of printmaking? All of printmaking. Oh, okay. I think the earliest found prints have been, no surprise, Chinese, 8th century. They were just mainly words, but they were definitely on paper. Printmaking is a way of describing an artist-made print, that the artist had a hand in the plate or the stone or whatever it was that was then transferred to paper. Earlier, printing was done on fabrics. For instance, screen printing is a stencil method. In China, they would put the stencils down, but if there were floaters, you know what I mean by floater? A piece that isn't attached, like all my fingers are attached, right? But if one of them was out here, it wouldn't be attached. So they would attach them by silk strands, or actually hair sometimes, so that they could print a larger area and have these floaters printing. Printing mainly fabrics at that time. So it's an old way and relief printing, which probably came from the seals that everyone had to state, yes, I said that, that's the amount of money you owe me, something like that. And those were usually put on red ink or paint or something on a bill of sale or something that was handwritten. So there are a lot of real early ways of printing. It wasn't really until paper was discovered that, and of course, you know, the West, Europe, was not very well civilized when the Chinese were still doing this stuff. So a lot of it was developed in China and then brought over. But it's amazing to me that, I mean, here in China, they're doing all this stuff in the 8th century, and it didn't really get to Europe until the 13th or 14th century. A lot of it had to do with paper and the expense of other materials that were used.
This is Bill. I recently became aware of a process that creates unique prints called white line printing, and I wondered if you'd ever tried that.
There are so many new ways of approaching an image that comes from a different surface. And a lot of them, in fact, if you go to one of the schools and watch an art teacher, you'd be so amazed to see all that these people can do with the leftover styrofoam little packages that come, you know, from your meats or whatever, and they'll have the kids kind of push their pencil in there and then roll on top and take a print, you know, and that leaves a white line. So there are lots, so many different ways right now.
This particular technique was you cut it in wood and then applied color to each of the different segments one at a time and printed it.
I was going to put a slide in of that when I was talking about relief, but you know, you can't put everything in all the time. But that is a wonderful way of working. And of course, a lot of these plates, I don't know if you know, have had a chance to read through the glossary, they come from all surfaces, all kinds of surfaces. It's amazing. And then there's offset, which is, you know, you have it in one surface, you put it on a different surface, then you put it on paper. It can get very complex or very simple.
We're finished. Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Um,